This is Walter Bosley, and I'm going to read a selection from Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men by Joseph P. Farrell. The alien abduction scenario and the moral disconnect. Martin Cannon is a researcher who has pulled together the most salient articles and books on the subject of mind control and compiled them into an intriguing examination of the alleged phenomenon of so-called alien abduction in an internet article titled "The Controllers: A New Hypothesis of Alien Abduction." However, the philosophical implications of his observations certainly spill far beyond the containers of so-called alien abduction and raise serious questions for the whole prospect of religious revelations as a technologically manipulated phenomenon. Cannon observes that within the field of ufology, and I quote, "The term abduction has come to refer to an infinitely confounding experience or matrix of experiences shared by a dizzying number of individuals who claim that travelers from the stars have scooped them out of their beds or snatched them from their cars and subjected them to interrogations, quasi-medical examinations, and instruction periods, as they call them. Usually, these sessions are said to occur within alien spacecraft. Frequently, the stories include terrifying details reminiscent of the tortures inflicted in Germany's death camps. The abductees often, though not always, lose all memory of these events. They find themselves back in their cars or beds, unable to account for hours of missing time." End quote. But the honest fact that seems to be a common feature of all these stories is that many abductees, for all their vividly recollected agonies, writes Cannon, claim to love their alien tormentors. In other words, there is a moral disconnect between the actual experience itself and the feelings its victims experience or recall toward their perpetrators, reactions that, under ordinary circumstances, normal persons would not feel. As will be seen subsequently, this moral disconnect is a common feature within post-revelation occurrences in religion, and even then, when so-called ordinary emotions appear to surface within the religious experiencer, these are quickly dealt with by a variety of techniques. Part 2, the false dialectic, Occam's razor, and their implications. Cannon maintains that a false dialectic of interpretive possibilities has been deliberately created around the abduction phenomenon, a dialectic created precisely in order to deflect attention from a possible interpretation that explains the phenomenon and its real origins. That dialectic is between the so-called extraterrestrial believers on the one hand and the abduction skeptics who would maintain that nothing other than particularly vivid nightmares are occurring on the other. The myth of the UFO has provided an effective cover story for an entirely different sort of mystery. Remove yourself from the believer-skeptic dialectic, and you will see the third alternative. That third alternative is to consider that 1, the phenomenon itself is very real, but 2, what produced it was a terrestrial technology and agenda, not an extraterrestrial one. Quoting Cannon again, "I posit that the abductees have been abducted, yet they are also spewing fantasy, or more precisely, they have been given a set of lies to repeat and believe. If my hypothesis proves true, then we must accept the following. The kidnapping is real. The fear is real. The pain is real. The instruction is real. But the little gray men from Zeta Reticuli are not real. They are constructs, Halloween masks meant to disguise the real faces of the controllers. The abductors may not be visitors from beyond. Rather, they may be a symptom of the carcinoma which blackens our body politic." End quote. This believer-skeptic dialectic is strongly suggestive of a similar method that I believe was put into place to control the interpretive possibilities of another famous UFO-related event, the Roswell incident of July 1947. There, once again, the interpretive possibilities were quickly promulgated by the United States Army Air Force within mere hours of each other, for it maintained that what had crashed and what it had recovered were either 1, a flying saucer with all its extraterrestrial implications, or 2, a mere weather balloon. These two poles established what I call the Roswell dialectic. What both dialectics are designed to do is to conceal the possibility of very terrestrial technological explanations for the two events, and to conceal the possible agendas that those technologies might suggest. This dialectic immediately reveals serious ramifications for the technological possibilities of explanation of various so-called special revelations in religious history, for one need but substitute the word God in the ET pole of the dialectic to disclose yet another possibility of locking interpretations into two mutually exclusive poles, to conceal a possibly hidden third technological alternative, that God becomes opposed to skepticism, that is to say, to atheism and agnosticism, with their so-called purely mundane trivializations of what ancient texts state about their special so-called revelations. Cannon states this difficulty in connection with Occam's razor, quoting, "Certainly we are not being narrow-minded if we ask researchers to exhaust all terrestrial explanations before looking heavenward. Granted, this particular explanation may at first seem as bizarre as the phenomenon itself, but I invite the skeptical reader to examine the work of George Estabrooks, a seminal theorist on the use of hypnosis in warfare, and a veteran of Project MKUltra. Estabrooks once amused himself during a party by covertly hypnotizing two friends who were led to believe that the Prime Minister of England had just arrived. Estabrooks' victims spent an hour conversing with, and even serving drinks to, the esteemed visitor. For ufologists, this incident raises an inescapable question. If the mesmeric arts can successfully evoke a non-existent prime minister, why can't a representative from the Pleiades be similarly induced?" End quote. And by the same token, if non-existent prime ministers and Pleiadians can be induced, why not Moses' burning bush or Muhammad's visions of Gabriel, and so on? There is yet another thorny implication posed by the existence of such technologies and techniques for religious apologetics, and that is the disposal problem. During the era of the CIA's initial mind control experiments, there was a problem: how to dispose of the victims of the experiments and thus keep the experiments secret. As outright murder was considered to be morally repugnant, the solution quickly devolved into erasing the memory of the event, or implanting entirely false contexts within the victims' minds by which to interpret it. Thus, a whole new chapter in mind control experimentation began, namely, how to wipe selective memories and replace them with false ones. And here, an experience of God, so to speak, will work just as well as an experience with ET, raising yet more possibilities. Part 3, Electronic Methods of Mind Manipulation. So what exactly are the known technologies of mind manipulation? How do they work? And what are their capabilities? We have already, in our examination of their planned and actual use on David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, seen some of them. The various means might conveniently be divided into two categories. 1, soft ones, involving techniques of manipulating the mind into channels of interpretive possibilities, such as was noted in the case of the dialectical channeling of the interpretation of so-called alien abductions and the Roswell incident. And 2, hard ones, involving actual technological manipulations of the mind by various means. Our concentration here will be upon the technological means as opposed to the techniques. In the CIA's own studies of the techniques and technologies of mind manipulation, which we may assume is a fairly representative template of the work conducted in other nations, virtually the entire spectrum was experimented upon, from soft techniques such as hypnosis, drugs, the creation and manipulation of religious cults, extrasensory perception, sensory deprivation, and conditioning, to hard technologies such as the use of microwaves, brain implants, psychosurgery, and all possible combinations of them. These experiments included projects for the erasure of memory, hypnotic resistance to torture, truth serums, post-hypnotic suggestion, rapid induction of hypnosis, electronic stimulation of the brain, non-ionizing radiation, microwave induction of intracerebral voices, and a host of even more disturbing technologies. Whatever the host of even more disturbing technologies may have been, it is crucial to note here the use of microwaves to induce the actual hearing of voices into the human brain. The implication, both for the ET abduction, so-called, scenario, and for the technological potentialities of alleged revelation manipulation, are rather obvious. The earliest types of electric manipulation of the brain included direct implantation of electronic components in the brain, noting that abductees often describe operations in which needles are inserted into the brain, and more frequently still, they report implantation of foreign objects through the sinus cavities. Cannon observes that as abduction researchers leap to the extraterrestrial conclusion from these bizarre circumstances, they have failed to familiarize themselves with certain little heralded advances in terrestrial technology. Quoting Cannon, "The abductees' implants strongly suggest a technological lineage which can be traced to a device known as a stimoceiver, invented in the late 50s or early 60s by a neuroscientist named Jose Delgado. The stimoceiver is a miniature depth electrode which can receive and transmit electronic signals over FM radio waves. By stimulating a correctly positioned stimoceiver, an outside operator can wield a surprising degree of control over the subject's responses. The most famous example of the stimoceiver in action occurred in a Madrid bull ring. Delgado wired the bull before stepping into the ring, entirely unprotected. Furious for gore, the bull charged toward the doctor, then stopped just before reaching him. The technician turned toreador had halted the animal by simply pushing a button on a black box held in the hand." End quote. This episode, recounted many times in the literature of mind control, palpably demonstrated the potentialities of the technologies even in the late 1950s, so it is a simple matter to extrapolate what might be done now, decades later, after enough money, research, and manpower, and those willing to throw morality and humanity out the window in order to achieve breakthroughs. Delgado pressed his research and was able by 1973 to report that, quoting, "radio stimulation of different points in the amygdala and the hippocampus produced a variety of effects, including pleasant sensations, elation, deep thoughtful concentration, odd feelings, super relaxation, colored visions, and other responses," end quote. Note that by 1973, direct contact of an implanted device in the brain was no longer necessary. The effects, including colored visions, could be induced remotely from a distance via electromagnetic targeting of certain regions of the brain. These types of discoveries soon ushered in a new quest within technologies of mind manipulation, technologies that could induce specific auditory, visual, and emotional effects in an individual or group target. Quoting Cannon again, "According to a Defense Intelligence Agency report released under the Freedom of Information Act, microwaves can induce metabolic changes, alter brain functions, and disrupt behavior patterns. Project Pandora discovered that pulsed microwaves can create leaks in the blood-brain barrier, induce heart seizures, and create behavioral disorganization. In 1970, a RAND Corporation scientist reported that microwaves could be used to promote insomnia, fatigue, irritability, memory loss, and hallucinations. Perhaps the most significant work in this area has been produced by Dr. W. Ross Aday at the University of Southern California. He determined that behavior and emotional states can be altered without electrodes, simply by placing the subject in an electromagnetic field. By directing a carrier frequency to stimulate the brain and using amplitude modulation to shape the wave into a mimicry of a desired EEG frequency, he was able to impose a 4.5 CPS theta rhythm on his subjects, a frequency which he previously measured in the hippocampus during avoidance learning." End quote. Note again that all is needed to entrain a wave onto a target brain in the desired frequency of a normal electroencephalogram, and this process can be used to inflict memory loss, hallucinations or seeing visions, and even inflict heart attacks from a distance, and leave no readily apparent evidence that this has been done. But such technologies and techniques were taken even further in work done in 1973. Quoting Cannon again, "Trance may be remotely induced, but can it be directed? Yes. Recall the intracerebral voices of Delgado. The same effect can be produced by the wave." Frey demonstrated in the early 1960s that microwaves could produce booming, hissing, buzzing, and other intracerebral static. This phenomenon is now called the Frey effect. In 1973, Dr. Joseph Sharp of the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research expanded on Frey's work in an experiment where the subject, in this case Sharp himself, allegedly heard, or thought he heard, and understood spoken words delivered via a pulsed microwave analog of the speaker's sound vibrations. Dr. Robert Becker comments that such a device has obvious applications in covert operations designed to drive a target crazy with voices or deliver undetectable instructions to a programmed assassin. In other words, we now have, at the push of a button, the technology either to inflict electronic gaslighting or to create a true Manchurian candidate. Indeed, the former capability could effectively disguise the latter. Who will listen to the victims when electronically induced hallucinations they recount exactly parallel the classical signals of paranoid schizophrenia and or temporal lobe epilepsy? End quote. In other words, all the technologies are now in place to induce in a human target via microwave radiation of particular frequencies all of the characteristic features of religious revelations, dazzling light displays, unusual sounds, music, and even voices communicating in real words. Yes, it does not stop there, for these technologies, combined with the soft technique of hypnosis, produced even more startling results. Quoting Cannon again, "Perhaps the most ominous revelations, however, concern the mysterious work of J.F. Shepitz, who in 1974 filed a plan to explore the interaction of radio frequencies and hypnosis. He proposed the following. In this investigation, it will be shown that the spoken word of the hypnotist may be conveyed by modulated electromagnetic energy directly into the subconscious parts of the human brain, i.e., without employing any technical devices for receiving or transcoding the messages, and without the person exposed to such influence having a chance to control the information input consciously." End quote. Continuing with Cannon, he outlined an experiment, innocent in its immediate effects, yet chilling in its implications, whereby subjects would be implanted with the subconscious suggestion to leave the lab and buy a particular item. This action would be triggered by a certain cue word or action. Shapitz felt certain that the subjects would rationalize the behavior. In other words, the subject would seize upon any excuse, however thin, to chalk his actions up to the working of free will. Shapitz's work was funded by the Department of Defense. Despite FOIA requests, the results have never been publicly revealed. End quote on Cannon. In other words, in addition to having all the so-called technologies of revelation inducement, if Shapitz's experiments were successful, and their continued classification suggests that they were, then those technologies could also be used to induce certain actions in response to those alleged revelations. All of these techniques and technologies' effects, it was further discovered, could be amplified by the presence of an implant in the victim. I've just read a section from Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men by Joseph P. Farrell.